Sarah.
Melissa.
What are we reading today?
We are reading The Husbands by Holly Gramazio.
Well, Sarah, if I read my calendar correctly, we are approaching a very important holiday for you. Happy almost American Thanksgiving in your neck of the woods these days. And I know when it comes to Thanksgiving, this is almost an athletic pursuit for you, actually, that you take it that seriously because you tend to host. And of course, with great hosting responsibility also comes, great trepidation. So how would you rate your pre-Thanksgiving stress level at this moment?
That is actually a very good question. And it really is like an athletic sport in both the preparation and then the consuming of the food on the actual holiday itself. So a lot goes into it. And anyone that knows me loves that I love a good gathering. I love to host. I love a party. I love a dinner. I love a dinner party. And but oddly enough, anyone who also knows me very well would know that I can get a little high strung when it comes to the planning and prepping for a gathering. So normally by this time I would be starting to kind of get higher and higher on that scale. But scale of 1 to 10 currently, I'd say I'm maybe like a 3, which I think is very good for me. My grocery shopping has been completed. I'm going to be preparing my turkey brine tonight, and I'm feeling good. We do have a smaller group this year, and I think that is contributing to my confidence going into this holiday. So we'll see when we come out of it where I'm at and how I'm feeling, but I'm good right now. And what's even better is that I'm taking a little bit of time, a little break to talk with you about books, which is like one of my favorite things to do. So that just, it's like the icing on the pumpkin cake.
That's right. It's win-win in this moment. Yeah. I can completely relate to setting kind of high expectations for hosting. It's like, there's the waves of the hosting experience, like the excitement of the planning and envisioning the whole thing. And then the sort of intensity of trying to make sure everything is right, and then sort of maybe even a moment of regret when you feel like maybe you're in over your head. But then when it comes close to time when people are going to start turning up and the house is starting to smell like the food that you're preparing and you can kind of feel that energy, then I'm always okay, this is my happy place. It brings me a lot of joy to host. So I know we're the same in that regard. But with all of that work does definitely, you require a bit of a break. And obviously, our favorite distraction is indeed reading, obviously. And we're in that sort of holiday phase, right? We are not quite there yet, but the next time you see us in these surroundings, the tree will be trimmed and we'll be talking about holiday reads. I know you and I are both trying to kind of identify what's going to be the 2025 holiday read. I think I've got mine settled, so, heads up for that in the next episode. But as we, prepare for that, we have another book called The Husbands by Holly Gramazio that we're going to talk about today. And I know we were a little bit unsure about whose book was even going to be the topic of discussion today, because you've embarked on is it a series or is it just a giant single book that you're also reading in addition?
So it is a giant single book, but it is also a part of a series. But it's the final book in a series that I have been reading over the last couple of years, and it just was published in October, late October. It's Philip Pullman's The Rose Field, which is part of his Book of Dust trilogy, which is a follow-up trilogy to his Dark Materials, which he had written in the early 2000s. And that trilogy is very beloved by me. And the continuation of the story, I really want to see, kind of where it goes. But it is like a 600-page book, this Rose Field volume 3 of the Book of Dust
Ah.
trilogy. And yeah, I've been reading it since pretty much late October, and it's been a bit slow going.
So
So I
you
knew
had to
there was
kind
no
of
way I was
like
going to be able to.
pump the brakes on that one and then pop over to the husbands. So,
Mhm.
I believe the phrasing that you used when we were trying to determine whose book and what one was, you said, Melissa, I think I can bang it out over the weekend. And bang it out you did. So why don't you give us a little bit of like a window into this book? How did it come on your radar? What's it about? Give us some context.
Yes. So I really did bang it out, and I was proud, and that I was able to predict that I would, and that it was a success because, knowing that we were going to be recording, we needed to be able to talk about something. And, my reputation was on the line. But so today is Tuesday for context. And I started reading this last Thursday, and then I finished it on Sunday morning. So it was a bit of a tight deadline, but luckily the length, which was under 350 pages, which is definitely a sweet spot for reading, and the story itself ended up making for a compelling read, and it really kind of sped the process along. And in terms of how I kind of came to get this book, this was a title that popped into my Goodreads, like books you might like category. And it was a little while ago. And I ended up picking it up as a used book very, very recently within the last couple weeks. And so um, I think it is going to make for like a fun conversation, and that's what I was hoping for when I started reading this on Thursday. So switching over to the summary, um, as Gramazio herself has described in, kind of the one elevator pitch sentence, The Husbands is a novel that is a story about a woman named Lauren whose attic starts creating an unlimited supply of husbands. So that's like a real like grab your attention, like what could this be? What does this mean? And to kind of set the stage a little bit, the book opens with our character Lauren, who is 31. She's living in London. She's returning home from a night out drinking and celebrating her best friend Elena's upcoming marriage. So her hen do, or stagette, or bachelorette, whatever term you like to apply to that. And only to discover that there is a strange man waiting for her, a man who it turns out is Lauren's husband, Michael. Now, Lauren, who is quite inebriated and increasingly alarmed, is trying to make sense of this situation because when she left her home earlier in the evening, she was a single woman living by herself. So it raises a ton of questions for both the reader and for Lauren. Like, so who is Michael? And why does she suddenly have a wedding ring that's appeared on her finger? And how did this man's photo appear on her lock screen of her cell phone? And why does her flat look the same, but just slightly different with slightly different paint colors and furniture? And as we discover together, Lauren and us, Michael is someone who is a temporary person in her life because as he climbs up the ladder to her attic to replace a burnt out light bulb, he comes down as a completely different husband. So she has been gifted or perhaps cursed with a magic attic that produces husbands.
A magic husband producing attic. Okay, so
Mhm.
I needed to get like a little bit more clarity on this
Mhm.
attic. So, for example, like, are all of these men living together in the attic or are they accumulating? Was this like a Groundhog Day scenario where sort of time stops and repeats itself? Like, how does she summon a new husband? And you mentioned the ladder. Is there some sort of mysticism associated with that too?
Well, all very good questions and questions that I myself had, and Lauren does as well. What is really great about Lauren as a character, and I think what makes it such a compelling read, is that you're really living through all of this confusion and kind of the comedy of errors that this book ends up being with Lauren. First and foremost, I have to say, like, this is a genuinely humorous book from start to finish. There are so many almost like laugh out loud moments. And Lauren herself is a bit of a funny character. She makes some bad decisions, and she muses and has lots of really kind of funny and interesting observations about these husbands and about her situation in general. But through trial and error, Lauren starts to learn that there are rules to how this attic works. And she actually starts to make notes to try to figure out. She experiments a little bit and tries to see, like, okay, how does this work? And so there are these rules, and I will kind of list them for you so that we're all kind of on the same page. So the husbands come one at a time. It is a one in, one out kind of situation. There are no excess husbands piling up in the attic. The husband can only be replaced after completely disappearing into the attic. So his foot has to be off of that top rung and fully into the attic before a new husband is going to come down the ladder. They do come with this kind of strange hum and flash of light. And then Lauren herself does investigate. She does end up herself going up the ladder to kind of see what happens. And she doesn't disappear. She doesn't appear in somebody else's home. But she does feel a bit nauseous, and there is that kind of strange electrical kind of humming situation that happens. And very importantly, time does continue. We are not on a time loop. So as each new husband appears, time continues on. It goes into the next day and the next day and the next day after that. So this is not quite a Groundhog Day situation. But the present is definitely altered by the appearance of each new husband. So similar to when, she encountered Michael, the first husband, her flat looked a little bit different. Sometimes it looks just slightly different. Sometimes it looks dramatically different. And then even Lauren herself might look or feel differently. Lauren does not remember anything about these husbands as they appear. So she really has to kind of figure out who they are, what their name is, how long she's been married to them, what the state of her relationship with this current husband is. And she does this by like searching through her cell phone, looking at pictures, and then even like interrogating in a kind of a awkward way the people that she's close to in her life. So her friends and her family. And she even has to sometimes figure out what her job is, because it doesn't always stay the same. Sometimes it does, sometimes it changes. But the one kind of continuous thing is that this flat still is in her possession, and she is, for the most part, living there in every single new reality that comes with these husbands. So those are kind of our ground rules right there.
So it is almost like a little window into a life that could have been or might have been. And just to be clear, these men, they can interact with other people then. So they're not like invisible to everyone else, a la, Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol type of visiting. Like people know that they're there because they understand them to have always been there.
Certainly. So, she's really coming into this situation, and she's the odd one out. She has no idea who this husband is. Everybody knows who the husband is and has their feelings about him. And there is a full-fledged life that is taking place that she's kind of stepping into every time that new husband steps off that bottom rung of that ladder.
It's funny how familiar this sort of storyline is in a way, because it did, have that familiarity like of the Groundhog Day kind of feeling, but yet it's a really kind of out there premise for a book. Like it's not something that one would easily predict, but it does kind of have that feeling of maybe being a little bit complicated. I mean, the minute we're talking about rules and, trying to figure out sets of rules, there's like the element of maybe complication. But then there's also kind of this feeling of repetition a little bit too. So did you kind of feel at any point like the thread was hard to follow, or was it a little bit boring with like sort of the one in, one out kind of motif?
So I feel like the author Gramazio does a good job of keeping the husbands quite distinct from one another, as well as the lives that they bring to Lauren. And if there is any sense of like repetition or blurring, and I will say, as we get further and further into the novel, like Lauren goes through a lot of husbands. Like we are in the hundreds. Like and but I think that any kind of repetition or blurring is quite intentional. Um, and as Lauren begins to understand what's happening and how the attic works, some of the husbands do not make it even entirely down the ladder before she's sending them back up again. And this is kind of based solely on like first impression, like what does the guy look like? What's the sound of his voice? What's her gut reaction? What does the apartment or flat look like? Is it orderly and tidy? And you know, the first day of this magic attic, as she's kind of experimenting and sending these men up and down, she ends up going through like 6 or 7 husbands just in a matter of hours until she gets to maybe like the 7th husband, whose name is Kiernan, who is very bad tempered. He comes down the ladder pissed off at her, and he refuses to go back up. And so she kind of has to live with him for a bit to kind of, you know, figure out like, how am I going to get this guy back up? And what's interesting, and then kind of, you know, going back to what I said about how sometimes Lauren herself is different. Like when she goes to look in the mirror after Kiernan appears, she sees how pale she is and how stressed and drawn she looks. And then when she's investigating on her cell phone, looking at past pictures and texts, she sees that it appears that she doesn't have a good relationship with her family anymore, or with her friends, that she's isolated. So like major flashing red flags. And so she sends him back up. And then the next husband that comes down, Jason, he's handsome-ish. He's a gardener. She has her back garden is usually a complete mess in her former single life. And it's like kind of like a little beautiful oasis when he comes down. And so she keeps him for a few days. She's even intimate with him. He's the first husband that she gets intimate with. And she only sends him back up to the attic because he's a little too eager to please her. He's a bit of a slob, and he chews with his mouth open. And within a few days, she's like, I cannot do this. I got to get this guy out of here. And one of the things that is kind of helping to motivate her to go through and try to pick a better guy is because her best friend Elena is getting married in like about, I don't know, 10 days to 2 weeks from that, you know, her first official day, you know, with these new husbands coming down. And she knows that her ex-boyfriend Amos is going to be at the wedding with his new girlfriend. And she gives us a little bit of background information that when she was with Amos, he always used to make fun of people and mock people to her. And all she can picture is going to this wedding, and she's going to be sitting with him and his new girl. And all she can think of is like, oh my God, I cannot be with a guy that he is going to be mocking to this girl. I cannot be the butt of the joke. And so that kind of ends up getting her to cycle through more husbands. And so that's like just like a little snapshot of 2 of the husbands that we see, but they all have such distinct traits, the ones that we kind of really get to know for any period of time, that it doesn't feel laborious, and it does feel like pretty organized and pretty clear. Like I don't think anything gets confusing where you can't follow it.
Well, and it must have been pretty clear too if you were able to like read through it quite quickly too, and you know that's indicative of like the clarity of the book, I guess. I can't help but like think a little bit too about Seinfeld, how like every single episode, like whatever, you know, love interest comes in, it's like they just find this one small thing and then nitpick, and then that you know that person disappears, right? Like it's very rare that you see the same person, like the same Seinfeld core character in a relationship for like more than one episode. So it kind of has like that same feeling. And yeah, there's all kinds of different like parallels too, because it did make me think of Groundhog Day and this whole thing about Seinfeld. But I'm also kind of thinking about Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin, which we've talked about here, because that book has this sort of it plays with the idea of repetition as well, and like the idea of infinite possibilities, but in like a game kind of environment, and how they sort of gamify playing with different potential outcomes of life. So when you're having these little glimpses into like the what could have beens, or what variables had to be at play in order for a certain outcome to have been achieved, it almost feels like maybe the same kind of themes are at play in this book too. Did you find that at all?
I'm really happy that you brought up tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, and this idea and this theme of like game playing. One of the first things that I noticed when I got this book was that on both the front and the back cover, there is a blurb by Gabrielle Zevin, who, you know, we always love a blurb, right? And so hers, it's at the very top, and it says, richly characterized, philosophical, and funny. I enjoyed all the husbands, even, especially the terrible ones. A time bending gem about the way that we live now. And what's even more interesting than that, and what definitely connects to this idea of playing games and repetition and infinite possibilities, is that Holly Gramazio, this is her first book. Her background is in game design. She designs video games. She's like won awards for video game narratives, and that's like a huge part of her life. And so, you know, I feel like she came to this novel with this sense of play and possibility because of that background. Like, it really is the foundation of the novel. And I think it helps keep it in this way that feels approachable because of that gaming background. And Lauren is playing a game of sorts, and one that involves her learning rules as she goes. I did end up, you know, reading a couple reviews, and I did even listen to an interview with Gramazio, who's super delightful and funny. But one thing that came up consistently in anything that I read about it, and certainly something that I picked up when I was reading it, is that this idea that the book is like a commentary on what it's like to date on the apps, so like modern dating. And I even think your Seinfeld point is like well put, because like, I mean, really, Seinfeld is that they're all dating, they're all single and in their 30s, and they're all kind, even though that was in the 90s, like there are still some like through lines. But when you really think about it, is like this kind of swipe right, swipe left culture that many people find themselves doing in an attempt to meet the one. You know, when you think about how Lauren is dismissing husbands so quickly based on these like really superficial characteristics, that's not that far out from what it is to dismiss somebody after quickly looking at their profile picture and a brief description, and just swiping your finger across a screen. And you know, later in the book, after one of her husbands ends up being her ex, Amos, he ends up being her husband. In fact, he actually ends up as her husband a couple times. And one time she sends him back right away, like, no way, I'm not doing this. And then another time she's like, wait a second, I'm going to break up with him. We're going to break up anyway. We're not meant to be together. And this is going to give me an opportunity to just be back to being single for a while. Because by this time she's cycled through like over 100 husbands, and she's frankly exhausted by the work that it takes to be married to somebody that she doesn't know. And with each new husband, like we said before, she has to play this catch up of like a life that's already in progress. And, you know, she was absent from the very important beginning stages that starts these relationships. So she's had like 100+ weddings, but she's never actually had the experience of being a bride or living through her own wedding day, which usually is hopefully a happy day in somebody's life. And so when given a chance to be single and approach dating on her own terms, she does end up using dating apps, and that ends up, you know, posing its own problems and work that she, you know, quickly tires of.
I can see how this book also is kind of like addressing a particular, like that sort of phase in people's lives when a lot of people around them are getting married and maybe they're not. And I know, like, from that time, like in my life, that people would often sort of say, and, you know, if I wasn't in a relationship, maybe I would have felt this way too. But like the idea of just like, I just wish I could fast forward, you know, like courtship is difficult. Like when you're in that phase of like trying to find someone, and you do have a certain, like, I guess like the list of things that you want in a partner, right? Like you have standards, and you know, you're looking for someone who you've kind of invented in your imagination or in your mind, and you don't know if that person's out there, but you don't want to settle because you really want to find this perfect person that's just going to, you know, make you so happy throughout your whole life. But then you also have to give people the chance to show you who they are, right? And that's what this whole, what dating is all about. But it is a totally different world now in terms of how people come to meet one another and what they know about them too when they do meet them. And I'm actually really interested in the whole piece with Amos that you said, like, she remembers him being really almost like critical of people. And so she's like assessing potential partners based on what she thinks other people will think of them, not even what sort of like what she finds in them herself through like dating them or courting them. But it is interesting how people will say like, oh, I just want to fast forward and like get to the part where we're happily ever after. But that's what happens to this character, Lauren. And then she's also kind of like at a disadvantage for that because she's plunked in the middle of this relationship, and she kind of has to work backwards. Like she has to fall in love with someone who already has fallen in love with her, but also knows all of her flaws. And she's trying to figure out who they are in the middle of the relationship. So I guess I'm kind of curious about like, how did the author even illustrate that? And then also like, did that just kind of demonstrate how relationships are work? And she was just sort of discovering that in this process.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, going back to what you were saying about this idea of the process of dating and this list, because a lot of times, especially like I feel like the older you get, and if you're single and you're like, I got to find somebody, but they've got to meet these standards that I have, and they need to be right for me, and you have like this really strong concept of like what that means and what that looks like. And this idea of almost like perfectionism, and like nobody is perfect. And certainly once you're in a relationship, all of that perfection goes away and you're just yourself, right? And I really feel like, you know, she thinks about this idea, like Lauren, you know, thinks about like, okay, as she gets deeper and deeper into these marriages and is going through these men, she does multiple times in the book kind of stop and try to pause and think about like what her reality is with this, and you know what it is to meet someone and what her predicament is. And I do have an excerpt that I want to share. Where she, you know, kind of talks about this in this way that I liked the description. So this is at the beginning of a chapter, and it starts with, in the past, she's let herself glide through lives, but not now. There is a time, she thinks, at the start of any relationship when the process of falling in love softens a personality like wax in a warm room. And so two people in love change just a little, pushing their wax figures together. A protuberance here smoothed down, but creating a dip there. It doesn't last long. The time when love can gently change who you are. And in the relationships that she's visited over the last 6 months, the moment has long passed. She has been presented with the shape of her new husband and invited to either contort to fit or reject him wholesale, which, that's tough. But I mean, I feel like it makes her not only examine the husband, but also, yeah, like kind of examine herself and like, what can I compromise on? Are my standards too hard? And like, there's this thought too of like, I clearly, if this is someone that I'm married to, I am still who I am in every single life. Like there might be little parts of me that have softened and changed with this partner, but I am who I am. And so there must be something about this person that I liked and loved enough about them to actually marry them. And she tries harder as I feel like time goes on to see where those traits are and what has kind of kept her in a relationship with someone to the point that she kind of encounters them as they step down that ladder.
That is an interesting image, like the wax, for example. And but I feel like,
Mm.
and obviously this is like a short passage. I'm not going on very much in terms of like that the narrator's voice or anything, but I often think about, when you're in a relationship, yes, you do make compromises and you do sort of shift yourself around that person, but that's reciprocated too, right? Like that they're also
Mhm.
shifting and changing too, and that's kind of the expectation. But it sounds like maybe the whole book must be so much more from just Lauren's vantage point. So, like, do we get anything from anyone else? Like, do we get anything from any of the husbands, like from their perspective, or even more from the people around her, like her family members or the friend Elena, to give us any kind of glimpse into like, oh, Jason really is such a great partner to you because of how he fixed up the backyard, or like, do we get more about the husbands from anyone else's perspective?
So it really is so closely tied to Lauren and her own experience. Like you are inside her mind viewing this entire, and you're making judgments about her because you're like, oh, Lauren, what are you doing? Or, oh, Lauren, like, why would you be with this guy? Like, you know that he's not good, or you're not giving this guy a chance. Like, he could be great. She does, though, as part of her kind of investigation, I would say, especially earlier on, she really does question the people around her. So she has a sister, Nat, her best friend, Elena, her mom. She doesn't have a super close relationship with her mom. Actually, lives in Spain, so she doesn't even actually see her mom throughout the entire course of this book, which takes place over the course of maybe like a year and a half. Um, but yeah, I feel like it is very kind of limited and focused to Lauren and what her experience is. So you don't really get the impression of the husband so much from their own perspective.
Does she ever confide in Elaine? Like, does she ever even try to explain to anyone, this is what I'm going through? I have this like stockpile of husbands that are coming out of my attic? Or does she know it's just such an absurd kind of concept that she doesn't even bother trying to share it with anyone? Like, who is sort of her confidant at least through all of this?
So early on, because it is such a kind of alarming and upsetting situation to find yourself in, to have these strange men coming down from your attic and to know that you're tied to them, like financially, romantically, like you're married to them. So she does very early on, I think it's when she's with Jason, she does attempt to share her predicament with Elena, and they're super close. They are true besties, but it's a real big ask to get someone to buy into the fact that you have a magic attic and that you've got these husbands. I think you're more likely to, have a friend that's going to be like looking at it from like a symbolic, like, well, yeah, sometimes it does feel like we're living with strangers. Like sometimes we feel like we don't know our partners, but you know, so she also does try to do some research. So she takes to the internet and is like trying to find any kind of forums. She's searching for like anything that could possibly describe what she has going on in her life. There is one character that she is able to confide in over the course, kind of further into the book. I don't want to say too much about him, except for his name is Bohai, and they become friends during one of her marriages. And they even talk about this idea of, what it is to find and keep a husband. So, like, this idea of her rotating through all these husbands, like, what's the stopping point? Like, how does she finally decide, like, what you know, when's the time to stop? When should I just settle for somebody? Which is, kind of like a universal question, even if you don't have husbands that you're cycling through, at any kind of whim. And so there's one more excerpt that I do want to read, and it's a conversation that she is having with Bohai. And so starts with, Lord remembers something she read a few husbands ago. After a morning spent Googling, how do people decide who to marry? Searches again, finds what she's looking for. Hey, this is her talking to Bohai. Have you heard of the secretary problem? He hasn't. Okay, she says. A while back, I was trying to figure out what I'd have to do if I wanted to find a husband to keep. And it turns out someone's done math about it, like the math that gives you the highest possible chance of finding the best partner or hiring the best secretary. Those feel like really different problems. She shrugs. Sure, let's start with the secretary side of it then. You're trying to find the best girl. Bohai raises his eyebrows. Is this a math guy from like 1952? And you've got a load of interviews lined up. And each time one of the candidates comes in, at the end of the interview, you decide if you want to hire her. But you have to decide right there. If you can say no, you can't go back to her later. And if you don't hire anyone, you're stuck with whoever's last, even if she's terrible. I just don't think that's how job interviews work, even in 1952. Sure, no, but what do? Have a set of predetermined scoring criteria so that you can work against your unconscious biases. He gestures to the Post-it notes. Call in references, take them on a trial basis. Mathematically, she says, you should say no to the first 37% of candidates. Then yes to the first person you see who's better than any of them. When he's thinking hard, his eyes flick round left, right, looking at imaginary logic. What's 37% of infinity? Yeah, fair, she says. So she comes up with this like determination of 30%, 37%. And this is actually like a real thing. It's called optimal stopping. And it's a mathematical theory that focuses on determining the best time to take a specific action to maximize expected rewards or minimize costs, which I mean, there is something like really cynical about like having to like take percentages and like, okay, well, the odds are that, if I, go for this person is better than all the ones that have come before. So I should just stick with them. And we are kind of approaching that 37% or as close as I want to get to it. So.
That is so interesting because, this like how I think about the algorithms, right? Because we've been talking about the apps and that the whole idea is that you're being sort of like fed people who maybe like satisfy certain criteria that you might have like filled out in a intake survey to be on one of these apps sort of thing. So it's trying to address your preferences. And then, so it is all kind of based on this math, this very romantic math. Whereas prior to all that, when I was, looking for a partner, like, you're waiting for the one, right? And people give you all kinds of advice, like, when and it just feels right. And it's such a totally different kind of like approach, because what this is suggesting is like, well, you can hold off, you can keep holding off, but what if eventually you hold off too long and then it's too late and then there's no going back? But they keep using this term optimal has come up like a couple times in this conversation. And we've talked about it as well with tomorrow, this idea of like trying to optimize things. And I just find this really interesting, this whole idea of like gamifying things and adding numbers to things that maybe should be a little bit more like maybe natural's not the right word, but maybe more whimsical.
Organic. Maybe?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I don't fully remember this series, but I know that Russian Doll, she was also a gamer or she was a game designer. And there was this, that was definitely a Groundhog Day situation, like where she was waking up
Yeah.
and it was her birthday every single time. And I remember when I was watching that show thinking like, okay, I know I've got like 3 episodes left, you know, because it was one of those like binged watching situations on Netflix. Like, how does this eventually end? Does she, I don't know, I don't want you to spoil anything, I guess, but like, does she find a husband she wants to keep? Does she, you know, after 37% say, okay, this is my optimal chance now to like lock this in? Was the ending satisfying? Like, what can you share about the ending without revealing too much?
So I do want to go back to one thing that you said about Russian Doll. And when I was reading this book, one thing that kind of kept coming into my mind was one of my favorite episodes of the series, Black Mirror. It's from season 4, and the name of the episode is called Hang the DJ. And it is set in like a dating situation where like something is calculated like about how long you can be with someone successfully. And so you essentially cycle through people and you only stay with them as long as what an algorithm has determined is the appropriate amount of time for you to be with them. And you end up finding these 2 characters who you're following and they only have one night together, but that night leaves such an impression that they spend the rest of that particular episode trying to figure out if they can somehow get back to one another. And that was something that just kind of kept playing over and over in my head as I was reading it. I mean, I do love the episode too, and I highly recommend watching it. It's one of the like, I will say, like, without giving anything away about that, it's like one of the very few Black Mirror episodes that doesn't leave you feeling like completely like depressed and devastated. So, but to answer your question, I had a moment on Sunday morning as I was reading and I was coming to like the final chapters of the book, and I was like, holy crap, I only have like 10 pages left. How is this going to end? And I wondered if it was going to feel rushed. And that's kind of interesting because, like, a lot of the reader reviews in particular that I read, the main kind of criticism was that this story felt like it was too long and too drawn out. Like it would have been better as like a novella, like 250 pages. And I don't necessarily agree, but I do understand those criticisms. But without giving anything away, I thought it was an effective ending. And I've definitely been thinking about it over the last few days. And even though it was a book that was super humorous throughout and it poked fun at this idea of kind of like the disposable nature of dating culture, I thought that there was something kind of poignant about the end, which I liked, and it wasn't as cynical as I think it could have been, and even that like maybe the rest of it was. So that's kind of my overall thought is like it was a satisfying ending, and it kind of surprised me. I
Okay.
didn't know that I was fully anticipating that it was going to end the way it ended, but yeah.
This is very
So.
intriguing. Yeah. Not only did you not spoil anything, you like did the total opposite. Like I'm left really questioning what happened in this ending. Well, speaking of endings of things, I think this episode is probably coming to its ending, but not, of course, until I ask the very important question. Sarah, is The Husbands by, and I don't, Holly Gramazio. Is The Husbands by Holly Gramazio a could read, a should read, or a must read?
Well, Melissa, I would give The Husbands, and you can see it was actually part of the Reading with Jenna club.
Your favorite. I'm
We've
surprised
had
you're not
ample
covering that little
conversations
dot.
about book clubs, but I would give this book a should read.
Oh,
I think it's fun. This would, I think, make for a really great like beach read, summer read. Like it was the kind of read that I needed to talk about on this episode. And I actually needed a break from like a book that is heavy and long, both literally and figuratively. And so I think for that reason, and because it is a very playful, it's a playful plot, and it's funny and it's fun. Again, it's not going to change your life, but it may make you think about it. And I think for someone, who's been married for a while, or even for someone who is out there on the dating scene, they may see things that either make them think or feel familiar to them. And I think it's a should read. So there
Well,
you
that's
go.
excellent. I really wasn't sure where you were going to land with the recommendation at the end, so I'm pleased to
Mhm.
hear that. And so, well, your pleasant distraction is done. You get back to work. You got company coming, so
I
make
got a
that
brine to
brine.
make.
Well, happy American Thanksgiving to you, my American friend, and I look forward to reconvening in a couple of weeks for our holiday reads.
I got to get on that. Love ya.